So I know we said questions, but I thought I would just use this slide to go through one typical case. I thought it would maybe, hearing a story might help it stick in your mind. So I'm thinking of a case of a little boy named David. And David came from El Salvador. He was living with his mother in El Salvador when his father left to come to work in the United States to earn money. His father's undocumented, lives in Long Island. His father's been here since David was about 2 years old. And the mother, from the age of about 2 to 8 years old, was taking care of David, but she had a pretty bad alcoholism problem. And around 8 years old, she just didn't come home one day. And David's older sister was about 18 years old, took David into her house. She was living with her boyfriend, and she and her boyfriend, she was pregnant with her own first child, and they lived in a particularly dangerous neighborhood in one of the major cities in El Salvador. One day, she calls him her husband didn't come home. He was arrested, and she discovered, she said she really did not know this, that he was part of a criminal organization, a gang. He spent about 6 months in jail. He had been sentenced to 25 years in jail, and then at the end of the 6 months, he was released. Lupe, who's this older sister, isn't sure why he was released, whether money was paid, an appeal was won. The system often has this kind of catch and release with some of the criminal syndicate. But when Lupe discovered that her common-law husband was so dangerous, she left him. And she and her little brother David and she's about to have her baby, her pregnant self and then her baby, went and lived with some distant cousins. When the husband got out of prison, he hunted her down. It wasn't hard for him to find her. It's a small community. He found her, and he said to her, if you don't come back to me with my baby and be my wife, I will kill David. And he said this in front of David. And then to make his point, he took his gun and shot it right past David. So David was not hurt by this gunshot, but it certainly made the point. At first, Lupe, not knowing what else to do, moved back in with the boyfriend, but she called her father in the United States. The relatives there in El Salvador decided they had to get David out, and they paid a smuggler, and the father didn't even know David was coming until David was arrested at the southern border. At this point, he's 9 years old. So David's arrested at the southern border. Lupe is back in El Salvador now with her infant child. She runs away again from the former husband and goes to stay with other distant relatives in El Salvador. David is released from immigration detention after about a month. He was held in a juvenile detention center in Florida. Then, after he was screened and they knew his father's phone number in Long Island, his father came forward voluntarily, even though his father was undocumented, identified himself, and David was released to his father. So when we met the case, David didn't tell us about Lupe, didn't tell us about being shot a gun, didn't tell us about his former brother-in-law, only told us that his mother had left him. And so all we knew from our initial screening interview, and the father confirmed this, is that his mother couldn't take care of him and nobody knew where his mother was. So at our screening interview, we identified this case as a special immigrant juvenile status case. And a pro bono law firm, the law firm of Wilmer Harrell, was found to do this case. And they began their second and third interviews with the family. They decided they wanted to know more about David's mother. And David said, well, you could call my sister. We have her cell phone number in El Salvador. As they're talking with Lupe in El Salvador, they're learning the story of the gang persecution and the threats from the estranged brother-in-law. And Lupe is crying on the phone and saying how dangerous it is for her and her child. And of course, there's no remedy in immigration law. Some of you may be thinking, well, why can't people just go to the consulate and say, I need protection? Well, if you looked at Claire's slide carefully, asylum law means you're outside of your own country. There is a bill that was introduced by Senator McCain that would allow in-country processing. The only time we've really done that in the past is with the former Soviet Union for Jews and Ukrainian Orthodox. And for Haitians, right after the coup, back in 1991. But there's problems with in-country processing as well, because you might be processed and identified as someone as a refugee, but because of the quota system, you might languish 8 to 10 years waiting in the country. So even if we do start in-country refugee processing for some of these children, I don't think it will solve the solution for all of them, and it is part of immigration law, part of asylum law for people to understand. We know people won't wait, that when they really have a fear, and particularly children are often guided by adults advising them, they will jump the queue. You know, there is no safe place to wait. They will try to get to the country no matter what. And that's what Lupe did. Lupe took her infant in her arms, took the little bit of cash her relatives could give her, and walked out of El Salvador to the Mexican, through Guatemala to the Mexican border, was able to have enough bus fare money to get a bus up to the northern region, and walked and turned herself into a border patrol station. This was about a year and a half ago. Now you're seeing many moms and infants doing this. She was able to not be expeditedly removed because she was under 21 years old at the time. She was only 19, I believe, at the time. And she successfully argued a fear to the Border Patrol officer. So she was detained briefly, then released to her father's custody. So now her father has a 20-year-old, she's turned 20 while she's in the United States, and his little son David, and Wilmer Carroll, the law firm, decides to file special immigrant juvenile proceedings for both of them. And for the father to be appointed, the grandfather, guardian of the infant. This is being filed in Suffolk Family Court. There's long delays there. There's fingerprinting. Things are taking time. In the meantime, the lawyers continue to interview Lupe and little David. And they begin to learn more about the El Salvadoran situation. Because they were a large law firm with quite a bit of resources, they also were able to locate an expert, and they paid a fee to that expert, who is a PhD sociologist who studies the gang movements in El Salvador. He interviewed both Lupe and David, and because he knows the situation so well, he actually knew the block that they lived on in the city that they were in, and which gangs were active in that region, and what happens to children who have no adults who can care for them. What happens to women who've been identified as the property of a former gang model? So Lupe and David, the law firm, decided to pursue both remedies. They're pursuing the guardianship in Suffolk Family Court because these children need to have protection. And again, under New York law, you can obtain a guardianship until the age of 21. So a guardianship for the grandchild, for David, and for the 20-year-old mother. And that hearing should be in the next month or so before the family court. They are pursuing at the same time asylum remedies, and David was granted asylum. The asylum interview was intense, and it was several hours. The lawyers were very well prepared. I have to compliment both the law firm and Claire, who went over every line of the application and every bit of the affidavits and the testimony. David just told his story in a simple way. He's not going to say to you when you first met him anything about the fearful brother-in-law. He knew to keep his mouth shut. And even today, when you ask him to talk about the situation in the country, he's very matter-of-fact about it, because try to think for yourself, maybe you knew people who lived in a situation of domestic violence or dangerous neighborhoods when they were 7 or 9. If you say, was it dangerous where you lived, they just say, it was, my neighborhood. It's how life is. Right? It takes the adult and the expert really understanding and contextualizing the child's case. Now, David was granted asylum. Why are they still going forward in the guardianship in family court? Well, they won't seek the special immigrant juvenile findings for David, but they will seek the guardianship because David's mother is absent. She's just missing. And a parent can be a guardian under New York law. The statute actually says parent or other person. So now David's father, who himself is undocumented, will have clear formal documents at any point in David's education, in need of medical treatment, or with the El Salvadoran government to obtain a passport for David, or if he wants to apply for a refugee travel document, which is a special kind of passport we give for refugees. David's father will clearly have the authority to do that when the Suffolk court grants the guardianship. Now, for Lupe, because of her age and because of the procedural context and how she was apprehended at the border, her case may end up being an asylum case before the immigration judge. That's because she was over the age of 18 at the time she was apprehended. but the asylum office allowed her to be a witness in her little brother's case. So it was, I think, a great example of a case that manifested in the beginning just as a special immigrant juvenile case, a mother that's disappeared and abandoned, but turned out that the remedy of asylum was maybe more advantageous for a number of reasons. And also that this was a case where it was appropriate to pursue asylum. We've had other cases where the asylum interview process can be so intense. And no offense to our asylum officers, they are trained. They're not all trained as well as some family court judges. So we've had other cases where the child was the victim of sexual abuse in the family. And in those cases, the child also qualified for special immigrant juvenile status. And it was our take with the pro bono lawyer, it's better to go to family court, where there could be in-camera testimony of the child and more care and consideration of not re-traumatizing the child, rather than having to go through the asylum process, which was, can be a 4 to 6 to 7 hour, like we've had kids interviewed in the morning, take a break, and interviewed in the afternoon. So not typical, but it could happen. So in that case where the grandfather was sexually abusing a child, the SIDGE remedy seemed better. So I hope by telling you that story, you got a picture that different things may come up during your representation of the child. And one thing you didn't hear us talk a lot about was immigration court. And that's because for the majority of you, you won't ever be in immigration court but once. You'll make one appearance in immigration court, then start pursuing the remedies. And when you pursue these remedies before USCIS, the family court and special immigrant juvenile status, or the asylum status, Judge Rowan is more than happy to receive your paper motion to terminate and say, whew, Safe Passage Project and the pro bono lawyers have done it again. They've closed a case. And of course, the minute she takes that case off her docket, the federal government puts another child in its slot. So we never get ahead of our workload because every month we get about 20 to 30 new cases.